Now, for the last part of our day two at the Graphene Conference, I'm delighted to introduce Darren Bischoff. Darren is the Director of Business Development at Nano, and today he will tell us about why the time for nanocarbon applications is now. Darren, with that, over to you.
Great, Christoph. Thanks for the introduction. Good afternoon and good evening to those of you. Yes, I'm going to talk about some of these next generation applications for nanocarbon materials. I want to apologize if folks came to hear more about fuel cell applications, as I'll touch on that briefly. But it's an interesting dynamic, and for advanced materials companies, as you are enabling differentiated performance with your customers and partners, often there's this dance or battle between what is allowed to be talked about publicly and not talked about publicly. But and such as being in the advanced materials business. So I'll just jump right into it. As in looking at, sorry, one second. There it goes. In looking at the lens for which Nano uses, we are primarily focused on single wall carbon nanotubes and fullerenes. We came out of MIT about 20 years ago with the goal of creating a process for high volume manufacture of these materials, and basically have done that. And then over the years, we started to look at needing to also focus on the downstream processes for easier customer integration, which will be a theme that we can talk about certainly throughout this presentation. So I think some of you have probably all heard of this in somewhat, in a comical way. When CNTs first came out or discovered in the early 90s, the thought was, well, they could do just about anything at this point. So they are being used for their mechanical properties, for their thermal properties, for their conductive properties, and NASA and Lockheed essentially, Martin, have put a fair amount of money into sort of looking at this as a science experiment. But what I'm going to talk about today is less about a science experiment and more about how these are starting to move into commercialization through these different application areas. So in terms of looking at, some of you are familiar with this, is the hype cycle that Gartner has put out over the years. If we look at the time frame that these materials have gone through, the great excitement within the scientific community, escalated in a peak of inflated expectations by about mid 2000s or so. And by that point, there was nearly $2 billion that had invested in nanotech startups. But I would put forth the idea that today we're basically moving through that curve, and CNTs and other nanocarbon materials are moving back up the slope of enlightenment, as we see, not only commercial traction, but even analysts starting to make predictions, forecasts based on not only imagine, if you will, but real commercial adoption of these materials. And so, what are these applications that are driving this adoption? And I take a look at basically this as a carbon materials value pyramid, and all the way from the bottom with high volume materials for rubber and carbon black, all the way up through multi-wall materials, and I'd argue that CNTs and graphene might be competing at some of these high value, high margin applications at the top for electronics and energy. And it's an interesting dynamic. I think that these lines are dashed for a reason, and I don't even know if they're necessarily in the right place, but there's a movement between each of these different sectors of that different materials, as they move down the cost curve, can start to address certain applications in these other areas. So I think energy materials is a logical one in terms of seeing multi-wall really seeing some notable adoption here, but single wall being, I think, identified by numerous different parties as potentially also playing in that space. And I think, also the hybridization of these materials is interesting. Mixing them together to address certain applications is another sort of theme that we see emerging